In this lesson, we're going to be discussing learning theories. Now, learning theories are simply a way to conceptualize how humans learn. That is, how do humans absorb, process, and retain information that they receive? Learning about how this process occurs gives educators a better insight into how to present the material. Now, we're going to be looking at one learning theory in particular known as multiple intelligences. This theory was developed by Howard Gardner in the early 1980s. And the reason this theory is so important is because it's had a massive impact on almost all areas of education. According to this theory, people have many different ways of processing the world around them. Unlike traditional theories of intelligence that focused on one single category, Gardner believed that people have multiple ways of thinking and learning. And the fact that people are unique and interpret the world around them in different ways was the basis for Gardner's theory and research. Consequently, Gardner believed that the IQ test, which was the standard way of measuring intelligence at that time, was insufficient because of its focus on only one or two categories of intelligence. Commenting on the state of education as a whole, Gardner lamented the narrowness of common presentation methods of his day, stating, quote, "We have this myth that the only way to learn something is to read it in a textbook or hear a lecture on it, and the only way to show that we've understood something is to take a short answer test, or maybe occasionally with an essay question thrown in. But that's nonsense. Everything can be taught in more than one way." Based on this belief, Gardner developed his theory, which categorized different intelligences. He identified and described 8 different kinds of intelligence. The first intelligence category that Gardner identified was the visual spatial category. This category is characterized by the ability to mentally visualize objects and spatial dimensions with ease. The next category is the logical mathematical. This category of intelligence is characterized by inductive and deductive thinking and reasoning abilities. Those with this ability are comfortable with logic as well as the use of numbers and abstract pattern recognition. Next is the linguistic verbal. This intelligence category is characterized by the ability to use spoken or written words effectively. The next is body kinesthetic. This involves the wisdom of the body and the ability to control physical motion. The next is musical rhythmic. This intelligence category involves the ability to master music as well as rhythms, tones, and beats. This may include individuals who have perfect pitch. The next category is interpersonal intelligence. This involves the ability to communicate effectively with other people and to be able to develop relationships easily. Next is intrapersonal, which involves the ability to understand one's own emotions, motivation, inner states of being, and an ability to have natural self-reflection and introspection. The final category is naturalistic. This category involves the ability to make consequential distinctions among organisms and entities in the natural world. Gardner also proposed a potential ninth category, which he labeled as existential. This category involves the ability to explore the big questions of life and existence. Now, perhaps the chief criticism of Gardner's theory is that he's simply presenting the idea of different learning styles, which was nothing new at the time. However, Gardner is often quick to point out that his theory is nothing like different learning styles. In fact, he states that the two are not the same at all, and uses the analogy of a computer to demonstrate the difference between the two ideas. In Gardner's analogy of the computer, he talks about the traditional learning styles view of how the mind processes information as being seen as a single computer. However, his theory this idea of multiple intelligences sees the mind as possessing a number of different computers that typically act independently of one another. However, there is typically one computer in the mind that is more prominent than the others, that the mind typically relies on more often than the other computers to process information. It's kind of the go-to computer. So the person that is musically inclined is typically going to try to interpret the world around them in a musical sense. The person who's the logical mathematician is going to default to the logical mathematic view of the world. And that's not to say that that person does not have any musical inclination at all, because oftentimes they do. And Gardner's theory is able to explain that phenomenon. Now let's try a little test. As you have probably noticed by now, this presentation has music playing in the background. It's Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 to be precise. Now there is a range of possible reactions you may have had to this music based on which intelligence category you naturally lead with. Now you may be one that finds the music to be a distraction that only hinders your ability to process and retain the information being presented. On the other hand, you may find that it helps you focus and later to retain the material presented. Now be sure to note which reaction you had to the music during this presentation when you comment. This simple exercise helps to illustrate the impact music can have on the learning environment and how it impacts differently some of the different intelligence categories. It also helps you to see how your mind approaches the material being presented and which category you may naturally lead with. As mentioned previously, Gardner's theory has had the biggest impact on the field of education. After Gardner's theory began to gain some notoriety, it was immediately apparent that much of education at all levels was tailored solely to visual, spatial, and logical mathematical intelligences. Because of this fact, many institutions have since begun to incorporate a variety of different presentation methods in order to best facilitate the education of a variety of different intelligences. We need to now consider the question of whether or not the theory of multiple intelligences has any biblical basis. We understand that God's universe is filled with variety, exemplifying His infinite creativity, but it also comes through in His creation of mankind, and I believe we see this from the biblical text. Let's first start with Exodus 35:30. Here we see Moses getting ready to build out the tabernacle. Look what it says starting in verse 30. Moses said to the Israelites, "See, the Lord has chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. He has filled him with the Spirit of God, with skill, with understanding, with knowledge, and in all kinds of work, to design artistic designs, to work in gold and silver and bronze, and in cutting stones for their setting, and in cutting wood, to do the work in every artistic craft. And he has put it in his heart to teach. He and Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan. He has filled them with skill to do all kinds of work as craftsmen, as designers, as embroiderers, in blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and in fine linen, and as weavers. They are craftsmen in all the work and artistic designers. So Bezalel and Oholiab and every skilled person in whom the Lord has put skill and ability to know how to do all the work for the service of the sanctuary are to do the work according to all that the Lord has commanded." Now I think it's very important to note that it is God Himself who endows these men with their artistic ability and who puts that skill into them for a very specific purpose. God creates them very specifically to be artists, if you will, and designers and craftsmen. And I think as we reflect on the often heady world of theological education and maybe other higher education, we see sometimes the importance of the artisans as being lesser than that of those who are more maybe inclined to lean on the logical, mathematical intelligences or the visual spatial intelligences. Uh, so it's important to realize that, at least from this text, it's very evident that God creates people with the artistic ability for very specific purpose and specific reason, um, and that they are just as important to Him as those who are more reliant on the other intelligences. Let's look at another example. Let's turn to 1 Chronicles 25:1. Here it says, David and the army officers selected some of the sons of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun to prophesy as they played stringed instruments and cymbals. Skip down to verse 6. All of these were under the supervision of their fathers. They were musicians in the Lord's temple, playing cymbals and stringed instruments as they served in God's temple. Asaph, Jeduthun, and Heman were under the supervision of the king. They and their relatives, all of them skilled and trained to make music to the Lord. Number 288. Here again, similar to the last example, God is using people who are gifted, this time in music. And it's important to note that it seems to indicate that these people, this is their primary function, that they're skilled and trained in the making and playing of music. In fact, in this text, 288 of them serving the Lord. It's just important to realize that these people very likely could fit into, obviously, the musical rhythmic category. They've been gifted by God with that specific ability, and therefore both of these texts seem to lend some credence to Gardner's theory from a biblical basis that God indeed does create some people who are more endowed towards certain intelligence categories than maybe other categories. As we come to the New Testament, we see a similar phenomenon. Look in Ephesians chapter 4, starting at verse 11. It says here, it was He, speaking of Christ, who gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, that is, to build up the body of Christ. Here again we see people being gifted by God for very different roles, this time for the purpose of building up the church. So to finally summarize what we're seeing here and to bring this all into focus, if God is creating people with different intelligences per Gardner's theory, which I do believe is very likely, isn't it then necessary for us to train them with methods that best equip them to serve to their maximum capacity? This is something to take into consideration, especially in theological education. Well, I hope this presentation has been clear and insightful. Thank you for watching.